All right, good afternoon. My name is Sarah Sikich. I'm the Coastal Resources Director for Heal the Bay. We're a nonprofit organization in the LA area. Our namesake bay is the Santa Monica Bay, but we do work throughout Southern California and statewide on a couple of issues. I recognize that I'm the last talk here, so hopefully I'll keep it brief so we can get to some healthy discussion. But I am here to talk about the Marine Life Protection Act implementation process and specifically how data was used to inform the designation of these marine protected areas. I'm going to start by giving just a brief overview of marine protected areas and the MLPA process just to get us all on the same page. I recognize some of you were probably following it closely, but I know others probably don't know much about it, so I apologize if it's repetition for a few of you. So I think it's to no surprise to anyone in this group that our oceans are under pressure. We've got coastal development issues, climate change issues, water quality issues, and fishing pressure issues. I love this picture off to the left-hand side of the screen there. It's a black sea bass that was caught in the early 1900s on Catalina Island, and it just shows, you know, what our fish used to look like, the big fish that we had here in Southern California. Some of you may have followed the study that came out this fall, or last fall, by Brad Arisman at Scripps and Dan Hondella at Occidental College that looked at the bass fisheries, particularly kelp bass and barred sand bass and spotted sand bass, and they basically saw huge declines in the catch of these, mostly because they're being fished on spawning aggregations, so we have a false sense of how many fish are out there, and it's catalyzed DFG to revising that fisheries management plan, but it hasn't been revised in 50 years. So, you know, our coast is under pressure. We do have some good fisheries out there. We heard yesterday about the California swordfish fishery, and lobster fishery also does well, but we've looked at things on a species by species basis. So we've got some challenges in Southern California in terms of our fish populations. But marine protected areas are a holistic solution. So they're a way to protect an entire ecosystem, its predators, its prey, and the habitat within it. So what are marine protected areas? I think this term means something different to everybody. In California, under the Marine Life Protection Act, they regulate fishing. So they address either commercial and recreational fishing, or one or the other. During the process, there was a lot of confusion about what they were all about, and there came some rumors about whether they regulated non-consumptive uses, research, all sorts of different things. Basically, it's just regulating the take of marine life from these areas. So in some instances, research will be effective if it is take-related research, but non-consumptive uses like sailing, scuba diving, snorkeling, all those sorts of things are still allowed in these areas. We've got two different marine protected area types in Southern California. The first is marine reserves, which are fully protected no-take areas, and you'll see those designated as red on the maps. And then there are also marine conservation areas, which allow for some types of fishing and some types of take, and those will be designated as blue. Another common misconception is whether marine sanctuaries are synonymous with marine protected areas, and it's something that's not. Marine sanctuaries have a framework for regulating certain types of things. Typically it's dredging and oil extraction. There are circumstances where marine sanctuaries have chosen to adopt marine protected areas within their waters, like the Channel Islands, but not all marine sanctuaries regulate fishing. So this is an image from PSCO, which did a survey of 124 marine protected areas around the world, and it just shows that California is not unique in using this as a management tool. There are 45 different nations and territories around the world that use marine protected area, and they've been used for several years. In New Zealand, there's been marine protected areas in place for over 20 years. And what PSCO did is they took a look at these 124 different marine reserves, the fully protected type, and they just looked at how they were affecting the ocean biologically. And you see huge, impressive results. There's a lot more marine life. You can see giant increases in biomass and density, which makes sense because you're not allowing for harvest in a fully protected marine reserve. Bigger fish, which is really important in the fish community because larger fish have a lot more offspring than their smaller counterparts. And higher species diversity, which is also beneficial for the whole ecosystem. I think it's not a surprise that the fish species are often the ones that mostly benefit in these areas. So here in California, the Marine Life Protection Act was a law that was adopted in 1999, and it has several goals, the first of which is habitat protection. It also has the goal of restoring marine life populations. It has goals of improving recreational opportunities, as well as improving research opportunities. And different from a lot of the other marine protected areas around the world, it requires that California's marine protected areas function as a network so that there's connectivity between all of them. When it was first adopted in 1999, DFG, Department of Fish and Game, was in charge of implementing it. Didn't work so well the first time around. There wasn't a lot of funding, and they put a bunch of scientists in the room to figure out where these areas should go without consulting any of the user communities, fishermen, conservationists, local governments, and it pretty much fell apart. So in the early 2000s, a new approach was tried where a public-private partnership was entered into between Resources Legacy Fund Foundation, which is a conglomeration of a lot of the foundations here in California which support ocean research, and the Department of Fish and Game. And since then, they've been able to effectively move forward with the implementation. And the other cornerstone of the Marine Life Protection Act is that it's a science-based process, so it requires that the best available science be used in designating these areas. So here's a map of how the breakdown went. Obviously, California is a huge state, so Department of Fish and Game broke it up into 5 different regions and was the lead agency for developing the marine protected area proposals. It started in the Central Coast area in 2004 and eventually sort of worked its way north and then back down south. And here in the South Coast, which ranges from Point Conception down to the US-Mexico border, the design process began in 2008. And as I mentioned before, because it was based on the best available science, the first thing that happened was a scientific advisory team was developed to provide guidance to stakeholders who were the ones that actually were going to be doing negotiations using that science to decide where these areas would be established. So the Southern California process started up with the scientific advisory team developing their guidance. The guidance did include some marine mammal guidance. It was pretty general. It focused on protecting forage areas and protecting haulouts. It also included guidance on size and spacing of marine protected areas and how much representative habitat of the different Southern California habitats we have should be included in the areas. It was a daunting task because there were 64 of us negotiating where these areas should be. I was one of those 64 members. It was majority composition fishermen, both recreational and commercial fishermen. There was a handful of us from the conservation community, several local government officials, a couple scientists who didn't want to be on the scientific advisory team but wanted to be in on the negotiations, some educators, some divers, so it was a big eclectic group, and it's really hard to negotiate with 64 people because there's so many different trade-offs that you have to balance. But basically, it was an iterative process where the stakeholders would take the scientific guidance, get together in a room, try to find out where we had some common ground, come up with a couple of proposals. Then the scientific advisory team would vet those against their guidance, come back to us with feedback, and go back and forth. We had about 3 iterations until we developed a final set of recommendations that the Fish and Game Commission then looked at. And although the stakeholders were supposed to be representatives of their community and interface with the people that they work with in Southern California, there was also several hearings where the public was there to comment on the different proposals that were before them. And as Magdalena said, I think she was one of the few people from the marine mammal community, but she was very actively following this. After the Fish and Game Commission adopted their preferred alternative, it went through the regulatory review process and was finally put into effect on January 1st, 2012. So to talk a little bit more about how the data was used in this planning process, I'll start with marine mammals since that's the focus of this workshop. Like I said before, the guidance was pretty general. We were guided to protect rookeries where possible and haulouts, as well as foraging concentrations. And one of the tools that we used through the design process was something called Marine Map. And this is just an image from Marine Map, but basically it was an online geodatabase where we could pull up different habitat types or different layers to look at where those existed. This example here is just a zoom in on La Jolla, and you can see some harbor seal haulouts as well as a rookery there. So we had that as stakeholders to think about whether or not we could place a marine protected area there. We also have really good habitat data, and I think that data was much stronger than the marine mammal data that we had, and it was also a stronger focus. So the general recommendation under marine mammals, just protect these general areas, was very different than the type of habitat data or habitat recommendations that we got. So, for example, it got very specific with kelp. You can see the green layer here. That's kelp persistence in the Malibu area, and we were basically guided to protect 1.14 linear miles of kelp in every marine protected area. So you can see how different that is than the marine mammal guidance we got. And it became a game of numbers. Through Marine Map, you could pull up a report of an area of a polygon that you drew, and you could find out exactly how much habitat you had. So this is just an example of how much kelp habitat was in the marine reserve drawn here on point 2. So with those detailed planning guidance, you know, marine mammals became less of a focus, habitat became more of a focus. And the other sort of challenge that we were up against is we were guided to minimize economic impacts. So we were trying to find those representative habitats but not impact the fishery as much as we could. And this is an example of the economic data that we had to play with. So these are maps that basically show value of different fisheries, and a survey was done prior to this whole design process by EcoTrust, which surveyed different fishing communities about how valuable their fishing resources were. And the gradient goes from cool colors, you know, greens and yellows, to hot colors, depending on how valuable the areas were. So the top map is of kayak fishing value, the bottom one's of party boat value, and you can see Point Doom ended up being protected, which people were not happy about, but we could have protected other areas that were a lot more valuable to the fishery. So this was the result of all that negotiation. These are the South Coast MPAs. There are 50 in place now in Southern California. It's about 15% of Southern California's waters, and only 11.7% are in fully protected marine protected areas, and most of theirs are concentrated out at the Channel Islands, which went through this process over 5 years ago. So you can see there is some connectivity, but from a conservation perspective, we're sort of at the bare minimum in terms of meeting that connectivity. And we've got a lot of areas that are blue, which do allow for some take. I think following up on the conversation yesterday about incentives for fisheries to think about solutions to some of the challenges we're up against, some of these blue areas allow for an interesting approach to restoration. We heard the argument from urchin fishermen that they're actually people who are doing kelp restoration within their fishery because they're removing the kelp predators. So in some of these areas, there are going to be tests on whether or not that works. Okay. So just to wrap it up, next steps, education and outreach. There's bunches of groups that are working on that in Southern California because although a lot of folks know about this, it's not broadly known. The Department of Fish and Game is lead on enforcement. That does have challenges, but they are actively enforcing. You may have heard about the Newport Beach MPA that already had a lobster poaching incident that's now being gone into the courts. And then monitoring. I just put up a couple or a link here to the main monitoring that's going on because I think there's probably some potential for data sharing from the marine mammal community and looking at what's being measured out there. So the Marine Monitoring Enterprise is leading that up. PSCO, Crane, Reef Check are doing biological surveys. Socioeconomic surveys are being done by EcoTrust, UCSB, and Natural Equity. And then Heal the Bay is starting a program called MPA Watch, and we're leading this in Southern California to look at human use monitoring inside and outside MPAs, because we won't be able to gauge effectiveness of the MPAs if we don't know if they're being complied with, and we won't know if there's recreational value if we don't see if people are using these as parks now. So those are also important surveys, we think, and it's a great way to engage citizens because you can train them to do the surveys. And I can talk with you more about that if you're interested in the program. So in summary, we've got MPAs now here in Southern California. The studies are being conducted, but there is little focus on marine mammals. Most of those are focused on the habitat and the fish and the economics. I think Madalena is an exception there. And I think there are several opportunities for partnership and potential use of the data that is coming out of this marine protected area for all of your communities and your research. Thank you.